A new Dogpack 404 video came out with serious new allegations against MrBeast, and it's not looking good. A guy named Jake Weedle spoke primarily about how he was going to be the protagonist in a video where he will be placed under solitary confinement for 30 days. The video was never released because Jake didn't complete the challenge, and it was a complete disaster that would have made MrBeast look very bad, given that the concept itself was essentially torture. In my previous video about MrBeast, I discussed how his content is exploitative poverty porn, and I used him as an example to explain why charity is problematic and why mutual aid or solidarity is a much better alternative. If you haven't watched that, I recommend you do, and I will leave a link in the description. I didn't expect to make another video on MrBeast, but Jake's words in his interview really caught my attention because they perfectly illustrate some of the issues with capitalism.
They were like, it's only going to be bad for maybe the last 5 days tops when you have nothing left. You're the first, it's going to be like a breeze for most of it. And by the end of it, after 30 days, you're going to get $300,000 because it's $10,000 a day. And I don't know, man. I grew up poor in North Carolina. I said, excuse me? I'll dance for you if you put that kind of money in my face, sure. I thought, well, if I have to do this, if I have to do solitary confinement in order to do the things I want to do, then I will do that. He said, Jimmy said, can you say to the camera how thankful you are that now you can pay back your student loans? You know how hard it was to do a take of that? And pretend to make it genuine? I don't want to have student loans. I don't want to be in a cage. But Jimmy's the guy with the money, and if you do what he says, he'll do what you want. You want your student loans paid off? You just be in this cage. And you have power over people. When one person doesn't have resources and the other one does, and they hold it over your head, and you go, of course, yeah, I agreed to it.
Later I will comment on another clip, but with this one, we can already see how capitalism degrades people and forces them to do things they wouldn't do if they had a truly free choice. Capitalism crushes freedom and people's dignity and identity. As anarchist Emma Goldman pointed out, wealth is the power to degrade, subdue, exploit, and enslave. The poorer a person is, the more willing they are to do crazy, degrading, humiliating things to feed themselves or their families. Under capitalism, workers sell themselves for a limited period of time, receiving wages in exchange for their work and obedience to the boss. That is why we, anarchists, call this wage slavery. Workers are turned into a commodity, and during work hours, and even beyond them, they cannot govern themselves, because you cannot separate the person from their labor power. In a capitalist company, workers cease to be human beings and instead become human resources. Historically, wage earners were called servants, and people didn't want to work for someone else because it imposed a significant restriction on their freedoms and degraded their dignity, as they were forced to do whatever they were ordered to do. Only those who didn't own land had to become wage earners to make a living or else end up on the streets. Most defenders of capitalism argue that workers consent to being subjected to the authority of a boss, and that workers and employers engage in free contracts. However, to make that argument, you need to ignore why workers are forced to sell their labor in the first place. The answer lies in their lack of access to the means of production, such as land or a workplace, because these are owned by someone else. This argument also overlooks the differences in bargaining power between employers and employees, which is usually heavily in favor of the employer. If working for someone else is not so bad, why aren't MrBeast and other capitalists doing it? To present capitalism as the freest economic system, neoclassical economics, which is not a real science but merely capitalist propaganda, goes so far as to present issues like unemployment and the number of hours people work as voluntary free choices made by workers, based on their preferences for income and leisure time. Of course, these same people are the first to attack the idea of a welfare state, even though that will allow workers to make a more genuine free choice between labor and leisure time. Again, the imbalance in bargaining power generally forces workers to accept whatever working conditions the employer offers, including wages and hours, with little room for negotiation. One reason anarchists encourage workers to unionize is to improve their bargaining power and overcome the natural power gap between employer and employee. But going back to my point, contrary to what capitalist propaganda suggests, unemployment is a feature of capitalism. Unemployment is the capitalist way of threatening workers with the loss of their means to make a living. The threat of unemployment makes workers more obedient and willing to accept poor working conditions. Few workers can take the risks associated with self-employment, so under capitalism, workers have the freedom to choose their master, but in general, they must work for someone, or risk starvation, unless there is a strong welfare state. Workers don't have the free choice of not working for somebody else because they need to make a living and don't control the means of production. The typical way in which corporate capitalist companies operate is the political equivalent of a dictatorship. So, is it better to be a wage slave and have the ability to choose one dictator over another, compared to a slavery where the master legally owns the person all the time? Yes, but the difference is not as significant as some people believe. We just happen to live in a society where wage slavery is normalized. But hopefully, a free society will exist in the future where wage slavery will be recognized for what it is. The liberty that defenders of capitalism preach is nothing more than state-protected freedom for capitalists to exploit workers, a freedom that anarchists do not recognize. Freedom is not the ability to pick a master. That's a mockery of freedom. For anarchists, freedom means liberation from being subjected to hierarchies and the exploitation, coercion, and degradation they entail. It also means the freedom to develop our full potential to the fullest extent in our own way without violating others' freedom. True freedom is only possible when people are guaranteed food, housing, medical care, and all basic human needs. You cannot call a society based on exploitation a free society. Under capitalism, those who own capital command those who only own their lives and skills. The relationship between a capitalist and an employee is by its very nature hierarchical, as there is an inequality in the ownership of the means of production, and one side has coercive authority to make the other side obey. Hierarchies represent a major obstacle to human progress because they provoke resistance from those subjected to them and waste a vast amount of creative potential, as only a few make decisions while others must obey. As anarchist thinker Bakunin stated, quote, "Power and authority corrupt those who exercise them as much as those who are compelled to submit to them." End quote. Yes, people at the top of the hierarchy do very well in material terms. They have big houses, better health, education, and so on. But by restricting the potential of others, they limit their own growth and freedoms. Just imagine how advanced medicine would be, for instance, if everyone who wanted to study medicine could do it. It's unbelievable how much human potential is wasted in capitalist societies. As Emma Goldman said, quote, "It is considered by all radical thinkers that the fundamental cause of this terrible state of affairs is, 1. That men must sell their labor, and 2. That his inclination and judgment are subordinated to the will of a master. Anarchism is the only philosophy that can and will do away with this humiliating and degrading situation. It differs from all other theories inasmuch as it points out that man's development, his physical well-being, his latent qualities, and innate disposition alone must determine the character and conditions of his work. There can be no freedom in the large sense of the word, no harmonious development, so long as mercenary and commercial considerations play an important part in the determination of personal conduct." End quote. There is still one more clip I want to play from the interview Dogpack404 did with Jake Weedle. After spending several days in solitary confinement with the lights on all the time, a form of torture that caused him sleep deprivation, Jake was told to run a marathon on a treadmill. Did MrBeast tell Jake beforehand he was going to run a marathon? Of course not. MrBeast is the boss, and he can change the rules whenever it suits him. This happens because of the power inequality between bosses and employees. And bosses know they can get away with changing the rules because workers usually obey. People who run marathons train extensively in advance, and even then it is a big challenge. So when Jake had to do this without training, the disastrous outcome was not surprising.
Did you try to say no? Like, did you have a choice, or?
Based on the Rubik's Cube thing and based on all the other stuff, like there was so much pressure to just do it, just do the thing, you know? And if I refuse, it's just, oh, that's the whole video. I guess the budget's, so much money up in flames because Jake said he wouldn't want to do the thing. And so I wanted to be a good sport, and I wanted to get the boost, and I wanted the cash, and so I started running at 12. I was able to take some breaks, and I asked him, how long do I have? He goes, until I get back. And I'm running until 3 a.m. All right, I got off the treadmill. Oh, the blisters I had on my feet were like, you wouldn't believe, just all over, just these big red. I couldn't walk. My muscles were like just the lactic acid. I got off the treadmill, and then the people that came in to like ice my feet, make sure I was good. Then that's when I was like, I'm done. I can't. I'm done. I'm out.
I really don't understand how some people who are most likely working class can still defend MrBeast, a rich guy who made money exploiting other people's misery, instead of a worker like Jake. I have seen more comments than I expected saying that Jake could have left at any time or that he was weak-willed. These are the type of people who believe the capitalist propaganda that a contract between an employer and an employee is the result of the free choice between two equal parties. Jake explained how much pressure there was not to screw up a production that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Stopping the production could mean getting a bad professional reputation and never being hired by MrBeast again. Another argument I have seen in defense of MrBeast is, but look at how much money Jake made in so little time. Jake stayed 10 days in self-isolation, so he made $100K, but after taxes it was $60K. More importantly though, this experience caused Jake physical and mental problems, some of which he still suffers from 3 years later. So, at what cost did Jake make 60 grand? At the cost of his health. Doing unpleasant and risky jobs is one of the main reasons why poor people have worse health than rich people. Yet another issue of capitalism and inequality in general. The lack of empathy from some people is surreal, and again, what's even worse is that most of these people are likely working class themselves with no class consciousness, who have or will suffer from abusive working conditions. Please stop with the parasocial relationship nonsense. Stop defending creators who do evil things because, no, you are not their friend, and they don't even know you exist. MrBeast was obsessed with going viral and making a career on YouTube. And in his early attempts, he exploited himself with degrading content like counting from 0 to 100,000 for 40 straight hours, or reading every word in the dictionary. What MrBeast doesn't comprehend is that he cannot ask other people to do this type of thing because his company is not a worker cooperative. He has a capitalist company, meaning a hierarchical company with wage slavery. So MrBeast is appropriating the surplus value of workers and making millions from advertisers and his workers. Self-exploitation is acceptable because it can be a free decision. For instance, I work every day of the week to produce content for my YouTube channels and podcasts, but I'm making that decision, and it has no consequences for other people. Exploiting others, however, is not acceptable, and MrBeast made his way to the top of YouTube by walking over the bodies of many other people. MrBeast videos are dystopian capitalist content. He runs actual Squid Games. And it's ironic because MrBeast doesn't seem to understand that Squid Game was supposed to be a critique of capitalism and how rich people exploit poor people's misery. MrBeast's content is pure poverty porn and exploitation. It is hard to make that more clear than when he told Jake to express how grateful he was for paying off his student loans with the 10 grand he got in a day. Instead of, I don't know, not exploiting his poverty for content, or at least discussing how student loans should not be an issue in the first place. In my other video about MrBeast philanthropy, I talk about this, but I want to highlight again that MrBeast videos are falsely apolitical or centrist. They push a capitalist right-wing agenda. Don't be surprised if, after this attempt to cancel MrBeast, he openly turns right-wing, like his friend and scammer Logan Paul. This should not be surprising, considering he grew up in rural North Carolina and studied at a private evangelical high school. I know that MrBeast is unlikely to fall because his target audience is kids from all over the world, and most of them will not find out about this drama. Unless legal action is involved for YouTube and other big YouTubers and streamers turn against him and stop collaborating, which is unlikely because MrBeast is the Harvey Weinstein of YouTube in terms of how much power he has over people, it's difficult to see the actual downfall of MrBeast. More important than making clear that MrBeast is not a good person and that his charity is all PR, the lesson to learn from this drama is that you should be suspicious of people who present themselves as very altruistic, and be aware of the power dynamics and imbalances in relationships between employers and employees. Don't defend the rich and be empathetic with working class people like Jake. Remember, no gods, no masters.